Hi, I'm Paige Agnew, and I wrote my paper on the women in Shakespeare's plays. Society's perspective of women has changed tremendously from the 16th century to the 21st century. In the 16th century, women were thought of as property, something to be commanded, and inferior to men. Slowly, society's perspective of women began to shift from inferior to superior in some cases. Women gained respect and were recognized for their intelligence and skill, along with their other capabilities. As I analyzed some of Shakespeare's various literary works, I found that from the plays Romeo and Juliet to Macbeth, Shakespeare's perspective of women seems to change based on their roles in the plays and their influence on the men in the plays, which seem to coincide with social expectations of the times. Throughout Shakespeare's plays, it is consistent that every character he includes has a specific role in the plot. Whether it be to overcome life's trials and find true love, or providing comic relief during the most serious of moments, each character's role is vital to making the audience perceive the play as it was intended. The women in Shakespeare's plays, however, did not hold major roles in his earlier plays. Before the 17th century, Shakespeare did not entrust any major decisions or tasks to the females, but instead gave men control of the play's plots and the women in them. Such an example of this can be seen in one of Shakespeare's earlier plays, Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet was a major character but had a minor role in the outcome of the play. She had very little control over her life and everything in it. Her family was very protective of her and preferred to control the decisions made for her in every other aspect of her life. Even though she was only 14 years old, the men of the Capulet family aimed to give Juliet's hand to Count Paris in marriage, despite her oppositions to the endeavor. Juliet, despite her family's oppositions and disapproval, was in love with Romeo, the son of the Montagues. Juliet expresses her desires when she states, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other word, would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes, without that title." As the play continues, Juliet becomes less involved in any of the events until her apparent death. At the time of her supposed death, all the attention is turned upon Juliet. The Capulets begin to focus on preparing to bury their daughter and mourning over her, yet she still has a very small role in the play. Despite Juliet's death, her family only takes the opportunity to put more blame and reason behind why they hate the Montagues. Juliet's role in the play does not have much effect until she actually kills herself. After that event, she has impacted the plot and her family's decisions as much as she could throughout the rest of the play. Before Juliet takes her life, she exclaims, "Yea, noise? Then I'll be brief. Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath. There rest, and let me die." Juliet commits suicide to be with Romeo, is the only real role Juliet plays in this play. By committing suicide, she provides the push that her family needs to resolve the feud with the Montagues. The Montagues are deeply upset by the loss of their son, but are also ready to resolve their feud with the Capulets. Both families felt ashamed that they had let their differences push their children to commit suicide. A contrasting example of female roles would be the role of Lady Macbeth. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth is a very important character. Although she is not seen by any of the other characters as a controlling individual, she plays a role in the murder of Duncan and eventually makes many of the major decisions that must be made. Lady Macbeth has the role of a leader who controls the events of the play while acting through her husband, who is seen by the other characters as an influential individual. When Macbeth has doubts about killing Duncan, Lady Macbeth convinces him to continue by saying, "When you durst do it, then you were a man." Women in the 16th century did not usually have many important roles. Women were considered inferior to men in many ways, including physically. Many people believed that men and women had the same body type, and women were just an inferior version of the male anatomy. This idea is reflected in Lacour's one-sex model. This model was believed to explain that the female anatomy was simply an inferior version of the male anatomy. This model also believed that the menstrual cycle that women experienced was a trait of both males and females. In an article titled Attitudes Towards Menstruation and Menstrual Blood in Elizabethan England, author Bethan Hinson writes, "In the one-sex body, the need for a balance of fluids was vital for the health of both sexes, and therefore what mattered in an imbalance of fluids was not the orifice from which the fluid was lost or the sex of the subject, but that the excess fluids were lost and the fluid balance restored." This belief that the male and female anatomy were the same but different aided the inferior view of women. Shakespeare reflects this inferior view in his earlier plays by putting his female characters under the control of the men of the play and pushing them towards marriage and motherhood. He even had Juliet being married off to Count Paris against her will at the age of 14. Despite slowly expanding the roles of his female characters, Shakespeare continued to have males, especially young boys, fulfill the roles of his female characters in the play performances. During Shakespeare's time, it was considered improper for women to act in plays and participate in such careers. Women were limited to careers such as seamstress work, cooking, cleaning, gardening, childcare, and homemaking. As Shakespeare's plays progressed, he began to realize that women were more than just objects. He discovered that women have very unique personalities and skill sets that can help drive the plot of a play. They can be very valuable assets to the other characters, as Lady Macbeth was to, Macbeth. Overall, Shakespeare seems to have matured in his understanding of women and their capabilities as his career progressed and he began to write more plays. Along with their changing roles, Shakespeare's female characters also experienced changing influences on the male characters in the plays. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet did not have much of an influence on anything. She was barely even able to influence her own life, which her family controlled. When Juliet learns Romeo's identity after falling in love, she exclaims, "Oh, my love sprung from my only hate. Too early seen unknown, and known too late. Prodigious birth of love it is to me, that I must love a loathed enemy." The only influence she had was with the friar, which she convinced to help her fake her death. In later plays such as Macbeth, Lady Macbeth was a character with a great influence over her husband. In the play, the other characters did not perceive her to be influential, but instead controlled by Macbeth. Although Lady Macbeth influenced most of the decisions that Macbeth made throughout the play, therefore controlling many aspects of the play's outcome. She was very underestimated by the other characters because of her gender, which was her greatest asset. After she convinces Duncan's guards to drink wine, Lady Macbeth feels accomplished in her actions, and states, "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold." In Strategies of Submission, Desdemona, the Duchess, and the Assertion of Desire, Emily Bartels claims that Desdemona often thought even though she was forced into submission, chose how to submit and therefore had an influence on Othello without him knowing. This depicts the beginning of change in women's social expectations. Before their situation could change, women would have to prove their influence. By manipulating men into thinking that they were submitting, women were able to prove their ability and start their reformation. Kirsi Stjerna writes in Reformation Revisited, Women's Voices in the Reformation, that even if women's place was seen as being at home, in relishing the holy calling of motherhood, women were impassioned to expand their vocations through their own experiences and aspirations. Many women knew that they were being underestimated and considered inferior. In Elizabethan England, these women attempted to prove themselves by taking on roles in the Protestant Church. They did not neglect their roles as mothers and homekeepers, but they wanted to contribute to and influence the spread of Christianity. According to Stjerna, first-hand knowledge of the scriptures and observations on injustice empowered women to use a public voice. Many of the limitations on women stemmed from the social expectations put upon them at the time. Women were seen less as individuals with potential, and more so as vessels with the sole purpose of being married and bearing children. Along with being diminished, women were expected to dress modestly, covering everything except for their hands, possibly their arms, their necks, and their heads. These social expectations limited the job opportunities for women as well. If women did not do seamstress work, cooking, cleaning, gardening, child care, or take care of their home, the women did not work. For this reason, women did not participate in the performance of Shakespeare's plays. Instead, the female roles in Shakespeare's plays were played by young boys. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet was expected to be very ladylike, proper, and obedient. Juliet, instead of being raised by her parents, was raised by a nurse who made sure she was taught to act properly, dress properly, and maintain chastity. Juliet's nurse knew her since birth and states, "Faith, I can tell her age unto an hour." She knew every aspect of Juliet's life and was with her almost infinitely. Maintaining chastity was a major social expectation of young women in the 1500s who were not yet married. Ironically, even though chastity was considered crucial, young ladies were usually married between the ages of 12 and 14 to men who were sometimes twice their age. They were then expected to bear children and start a family before their lives had really even started. When Juliet is informed that her family intends her to marry Count Paris, her nurse tries reassuring her that this is a great thing by saying, "A man, young lady. Lady, such a man, as all the world. Why, he's a man of wax." In Macbeth, the men were considered to be the leaders, as they were often fighting in wars or engaging in economic endeavors. This play gave female characters, such as Lady Macbeth and the three witches, a chance at controlling the situation. The witches predicted and gave light to all the events that were to happen in the play, which suggests that they were very intelligent. In Act 1, the three witches encounter Macbeth and make their first prediction, stating, "All hail Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis! All hail Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor! All hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter." Similarly, Lady Macbeth was shown to be intelligent through her successful plots against the king. She is able to successfully plot and carry out Duncan's murder by knowing her husband's weaknesses. She exploits his weakness by stating, "When you durst do it, then you were a man." Lady Macbeth knows that her husband wants to prove that he is powerful and a leader, so she uses his desires to influence him to commit the murder. In Elizabethan England, society considered men and women to have the same anatomy, except that women were of inferior development. They even had an explanation for the menstrual cycle women experience. They claimed that this cycle was just the body's way of correcting internal fluid imbalances. Bethan Henson claims, "In the one-sex body, the need for a balance of fluids was vital for the health of both sexes, and therefore, what mattered in an imbalance of fluids was not the orifice from which the fluid was lost or the sex of the subject, but that the excess fluids were lost and the fluid balance restored." This piece of information gives light as to exactly how unjust the Elizabethan society of England was to women of the time. The society of the Elizabethan era was so set in the belief that women were inferior, in need of control, they refused to recognize that they had any difference from men except for inferiority. Women were refused even this basic aspect of individuality and perceived to be weaker forms of men. Even though many of the social expectations for women have changed, some of them have not been considerably different until recently. In an article titled "Call for Virginity Testing Ban," the Bulletin of the World Health Organization informs the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Entity of Gender Equality, and the Empowerment of Women, and WHO made a global appeal in October to end virginity testing on women. Mandatory virginity testing for women was often requested by parents or spouses of young women in order to determine if they were suitable marriage material. This test has also been requested by employers to satisfy employment eligibility. This unproven method of chastity measurement is now considered unnecessary and somewhat cruel. It is an invasion of a woman's privacy and a very demeaning act. As I analyzed Shakespeare's plays, Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth, it became very apparent that Shakespeare's overall perception of his female characters had changed somewhere along the way. After examining both plays and other supporting articles, I have concluded that this shift in perspective was caused by the shift in social expectations for women in Elizabethan England. Society considered women proper vessels to be controlled by their husbands and inferior. Women were expected to be proper, modest, obedient, and chaste. As these concepts were widely accepted, Shakespeare's plays, such as Romeo and Juliet, reflected them. When women began to become involved in the Protestant Church and the spread of Christianity, society's expectations of them began to change. Concurrently, Shakespeare's plays, such as Macbeth, began to depict women as having influence, capability, and identity. Even though the social expectations of women still exist, they have changed drastically from the 16th century to present day. Women have gained respect as leaders, entrepreneurs, intellectuals, and innovationists without having to act through the men around them. Although Shakespeare initially believed women were inferior, he recognized that they could be powerful and influential individuals far before they had gained the full ability to assert themselves. As Shakespeare continued to write his plays with more empowerment for the female characters, he was influencing an unsuspecting society to view women as he did. Slowly, the Elizabethan society began to perceive women as influential individuals that possessed the potential to accomplish much more than anyone could have suspected.